Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Thursday, December 19, 2024. House Republicans unveil a new proposal to prevent a federal government shutdown when the current funding runs out Friday at midnight. And this one includes a debt ceiling increase, as President-elect Donald Trump has required. President Joe Biden announces new climate goals for the United States, cutting greenhouse gas emissions at least 61% below 2005 levels by 2035. White House economic advisor Lael Brainard talks about a new report on supply chain resiliency. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer asked by a fellow member of Parliament about U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's threat to impose tariffs on British products. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken makes what could be his final trip as Secretary to the United Nations, chairing a Security Council meeting on Sudan's civil war. Associated Press writes that President-elect Donald Trump announced success with a new plan to fund the government and lift the debt ceiling a day before a government shutdown. He praised Speaker Mike Johnson and House Republicans for coming to a, quote, very good deal, urging Congress to swiftly pass it in votes as soon as Thursday evening. Congressman Tom Cole, Republican from Oklahoma, chair of the Appropriations Committee, led the debate on the House floor.
I know there's great frustration that a second continuing resolution is necessary, and quite frankly, I share in that feeling. But a government shutdown is never a good alternative. So today's bill funds the government through March 14th. This will allow Republicans to engage President Trump as we negotiate a final year funding bills that fulfill the mandate of the American people and our America First agenda. Further, this route ensures that there are no undue disruptions to our national security and the vital programs that our constituents rely on. Today's bill also extends out the debt limit for a further 2 years to January 20th, 2027. This will allow President-elect Trump to begin his term without needing to immediately address our national debt limit, allowing us to move forward on the many other pressing concerns of the American people. Finally, the legislation also provides much-needed relief to Americans struggling to recover from recent natural disasters. This includes destruction in my own district, which faced tornadoes that ripped through Oklahoma. From floods and droughts to wildfires and other storms, communities across the United States have suffered. These realities have been grim. I recently visited North Carolina at the invitation of my good friend and fellow Appropriations Committee member Chuck Edwards, and saw with my own eyes the devastation and damage caused by Hurricane Helene's catastrophic flooding. Months after the storm, countless people remain without basic necessities of life, and the region will remain affected for years to come. My takeaway from these experiences is clear. Congress must act. We need to provide the necessary disaster recovery aid for states and communities as our fellow citizens rebuild and restore. The relief efforts are ongoing. It will be months, if not years, before life returns to normal. Additional investments necessary to provide needed assistance to our fellow Americans. Today's measure fully funds our existing relief requirements, ensuring that help and resources can get to those who desperately need them. Rural communities, particularly our farmers and ranchers, are facing a tough farm economy and the aftermath of multiple disasters, and these are prioritized in this legislation. While there's still a long road ahead for recovery efforts and rebuilding, this aid will mark a vital step forward.
Congressman Tom Cole, Republican from Oklahoma, chair of the Appropriations Committee, debate on the House floor on this extension of temporary government funding. Current funding runs out Friday at midnight, and the bill under consideration would fund federal agencies through March 14th. It also keeps the $100 billion in disaster aid for victims of Hurricanes Helene and Milton and other natural disasters that was in a previous version of this CR, or continuing resolution. Also maintains $10 billion in assistance for farmers with high input costs and low commodity prices. And it adds a provision that President-elect Donald Trump said he needed, and that's suspending the nation's debt limit from January 1st of next year to January 30th, 2027. It does include something that was in the previous version, the Francis Scott Key Bridge, rebuilding that bridge, paying for that. It does remove some provisions from the earlier version of the CR, including a pay raise for members of Congress, and the provision that would transfer RFK Stadium property in the District of Columbia from the federal government to the district government. That was designed so that perhaps in the future there could be a stadium built for the NFL team, Washington Commanders. More from the House floor debate. Rosa DeLauro, Democrat from Connecticut, is the ranking member on the Appropriations Committee.
We had a strong bipartisan, bicameral agreement among the leadership of both parties at both ends of the Capitol to avert a disastrous and pointless government shutdown, to provide desperately needed disaster aid and emergency assistance, and to provide Congress with the time required to enact full-year bills, funding bills, for fiscal year 2025. That bill was a result of a compromise. There were things in it that Democrats liked and Republicans did not. And there were things in it that Republicans liked and Democrats would have preferred to leave out. But that is the nature of government funding bills. They require compromise and the support of Democrats and Republicans that we in the House and Senate need to have in order to become a law. That was true throughout the 118th Congress, despite Republicans' repeated and failed efforts to write extreme and partisan funding bills, and that will be true in the 119th Congress as well. Yes, we were on the cusp of an agreement to move this country forward. Yesterday, a multi-billionaire with apparently no working knowledge of government or of appropriations, a self-appointed president of the United States, Elon Musk, issued a marching order for House Republicans to go against their own elected leadership and shut down the government. Soon after, Congress was on a fast track to a government shutdown. House Republicans are responsible for any harm and uncertainty brought upon the American people, and should some get their wish for a month-long government shutdown, they will be responsible for cleaning up their mess come Inauguration Day. We are in completely unprecedented times. The world's richest man, an unelected contractor reaping billions in government contracts, is calling the shots in the Republican Party. Who is in charge? And at the behest of the world's richest man, who no one voted for, the United States Congress has been thrown into pandemonium. We had a bill on Tuesday that was the result of a year and a half of work in which had the input of Republicans and Democrats, their interests, their concerns, the needs of their constituents. This bill has no such bipartisan input, and we are considering it in mere minutes after it was released. It removed key provisions to limit the power of pharmaceutical companies. It abandons our bipartisan efforts to ensure American dollars and intellectual property are reinvested in American businesses and workers, instead of fueling the Chinese Communist Party's technology and capabilities. It includes a 2-year raising of the debt limit. What does that do? That serves to allow Republicans to cut taxes on the ultra-wealthy like Elon Musk, raise deficits on the backs of the American people. We must immediately return to considering the bipartisan, bicameral compromise legislation that Speaker Johnson, Leader Schumer, Leader Jeffries, Leader McConnell, and the four corners of the Appropriations Committee reached earlier this week. We must unequivocally reject the illegitimate oligarchy that seeks to usurp the authority of the United States Congress and of the American people.
Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro, Democrat from Connecticut, ranking member on the Appropriations Committee, during House floor debate on the latest bill to extend government funding from tomorrow's deadline through March 14th of 2025 and prevent a government shutdown. House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, did not participate in the floor debate but did make a statement outside the chamber.
Evening, everybody. This is Washington. This is how the lawmaking is done. It's a long process. Sometimes it takes a while to reach consensus, but we're going to do the right thing here tonight. The American Relief Act of 2024 will provide temporary funding to get us into the first part of next year. We're excited about that because Republicans will have control of the White House and the Senate and the House, and we'll be able to make the key decisions about funding for the 2025 fiscal year. So this will allow us the opportunity to do that. In addition, we're going to take care of Americans who have suffered true devastating emergencies and disasters. We had, of course, a record hurricane season with Helene and Milton that did real damage across as many as 6 states. There's $100 billion to provide much needed relief to those people, those Americans who've really been struggling and still are from those storms. And in addition to that, we have $10 billion of emergency aid to our farmers and ranchers. Many of the small farms in America are on the verge of collapse, primarily because of Bidenomics and inflation, the high cost of inputs and fertilizer and seed and everything that they need to keep those farms going. And they've had 3 lost years in a row, some of it because of drought, a lot of it because of the economics of it, and it doesn't make sense for lenders to provide them funding anymore. And so this is a stopgap measure to save those farms, to save food production in America, to ensure that we have that diversity in the marketplace, and our food supply is directly related to national security. So it's a very, very important thing for both parties to do, to provide that aid. We also have a clean extension of the Farm Bill, a clean extension of health extenders that are necessary, and a couple of other details. Everything that I just told you was negotiated in a bipartisan fashion. Both parties agreed to these terms, and that's what's on the floor right now. The only change in this legislation is that we are going to push the debt limit to January 30th of 2027. We will push it beyond that, or to that time point, and that will allow us to do the important work of governing in the new Congress. Why does that matter? Because we are committed to cutting hundreds of billions of dollars of wasteful spending out of the federal budget. That's what we're going to do. The DOGE effort with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, the commitments that President Trump made on the campaign trail will come to fruition when we get about that very important work for the American people. The government is too big, it does too many things, and it does very few things well. We're going to cut and limit the size and scope of the government and get it under control for the American people. We have a mandate to do so. President Trump received 77 million votes in the election. House Republicans, 74.7 million votes, the most in history. We know what we are to do. We're determined to do that. And even though this vote would push the debt limit to 2027, it in no way reflects any lack of enthusiasm on our part to get about those serious cuts for the American people. We have to have fiscal responsibility as a core principle of our party. So that's what the House Republicans are committed to, every single one of them. We will get together and do that work, and it begins in early January. I hope that this vote passes tonight. We will send it to the Senate. We will extend funding, and we'll come back, and we will have the America First agenda come in roaring in January for the American people. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Especially at the last minute. Do you wish Trump?
House Speaker Mike Johnson, Republican from Louisiana, making that statement outside the House chamber as the House was debating that bill to extend government funding. A statement from White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre, and the title says, on Republicans' billionaire giveaway, reads, Republicans are doing the bidding of their billionaire benefactors at the expense of hardworking Americans. Republicans are breaking their word to support a bipartisan agreement that would lower prescription drug costs and make it harder to offshore jobs to China, and instead putting forward a bill that paves the way for tax breaks for billionaires while cutting critical programs working families count on, from Social Security to Head Start. President Biden supports the bipartisan agreement to keep the government open, help communities recovering from disasters, and lower costs, not this giveaway to billionaires that Republicans are proposing at the 11th hour. That was the full statement from White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre. More from the House floor debate. Here is the House Minority Leader, Hakeem Jeffries, Democrat from New York.
House Democrats, House Republicans, Senate Democrats, and Senate Republicans reached a bipartisan agreement to fund the government, prevent a shutdown, and meet the needs of the American people. We reached a bipartisan agreement to provide disaster assistance to people who had their lives turned upside down by extreme weather events, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, and wildfires all across America. We reached a bipartisan agreement to be there for farmers and families, children, seniors, working class Americans all across the country. The men and women who serve this country in uniform and are veterans. House Republicans have abandoned that bipartisan agreement that we entered into in good faith. A bill that House Republicans negotiated gave us your word that we were going to move forward together on behalf of the American people. It was a Republican-drafted bill that was posted by House Republicans. And then one or two puppet masters weigh in, and the extreme MAGA Republicans decide to do the bidding of the wealthy, the well-off, the well-connected, millionaires and billionaires, not working-class people all across America. The bill that is before us today is just part of an effort to shut down the government. Unless we, as representatives of the American people, bend to the will of just a handful of millionaires and billionaires, because the provisions in this bill, particularly as it relates to suspending the debt ceiling for 2 years, are designed to bring about a massive tax cut, unpaid for wealthy donors and for wealthy corporations, for millionaires and billionaires who clearly some in this Congress are working for. And this bill is validation for it. Now, what's been interesting to me is that for decades, the Republican Party has lectured America about fiscal responsibility, about the debt and the deficit. It's always been phony. This bill proves it. The one thing we do know is that every time a Republican president comes into office, the one thing we can count on Republicans to do is to pass a massive tax cut for wealthy Americans, and in the process, stick working-class Americans with the bill.
Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader, Democrat from New York, on the House floor during debate on the latest version of the bill put forth by the House Republicans to extend government funding from the deadline tomorrow, Friday, midnight, to March 14, 2025. It has all the other provisions that the members have been talking about. Because this bill was brought up under the procedure suspension of the rules, required a two-thirds vote to pass. It did not pass. Almost all Democrats voted no, but so did a couple of dozen Republicans, including Chip Roy of Texas, who spoke before the vote.
When I ran for Congress in 2018, the debt was $21 trillion. I was just texting with my son back home in Austin, who I haven't seen in quite a long time because I'm here trying to fight for him. When I got through cancer about 12 years ago, I made my promise to my kids that I would do everything I can to save this country. And what we're doing right now is to continue to double down on the things that are destroying the republic. We are going to increase the debt ceiling, not just $4 trillion, that's false. We have spent $4.7 trillion in additional debt in the last 19 months. We're going to increase the debt by $5 trillion. That's what's going to happen right here by Republicans, increasing the debt $5 trillion. And what are you doing in the same bill? $110 billion unpaid for. Because you never have any ounce of self-respect to go out and campaign saying you're going to balance the budget, and then you come in here and pass $110 billion unpaid for. On top of the $200 billion you did for WEP, you guys won't agree with that, but the fact of the matter is $330 billion. Congratulations, you've added to the debt since you were given the majority again on November 5th. It's embarrassing. It's shameful. Yes, I think this bill is better than it was yesterday on certain respects, but to take this bill yesterday and congratulate yourself because it's shorter in pages, but increases the debt by $5 trillion is asinine.
Congressman Chip Roy, Republican from Texas, on the House floor before the vote to pass this bill, and it did fail. Required a two-thirds majority to pass under the procedures being used, and it didn't even get a majority. While the negotiations over this latest version of the CR, continuing resolution to keep the government funded, were taking place earlier today, President-elect Donald Trump posted this on Truth Social. The very unpopular congressman, in quotes, from Texas, Chip Roy, is getting in the way, as usual, of having yet another great Republican victory, all for the sake of some cheap publicity for himself. Republican obstructionists have to be done away with. The Democrats are using them, and we can't let it happen. And then Congressman Roy posted on X, "My position is simple. I'm not going to raise or suspend the debt ceiling, racking up more debt without significant and real spending cuts attached to it. I've been negotiating to that end. No apologies." This is Washington Today. And with the federal government so close to a possible shutdown, the Pentagon Press Secretary Pat Ryder spoke about it at his news conference this afternoon.
I also want to address up front a potential government shutdown and the implications should a shutdown occur. As we are a planning organization, the department has conducted prudent planning and preparations for a potential shutdown, and our senior leaders have updated our contingency plans. Secretary Austin and DoD leaders are monitoring the situation closely and remain committed to doing everything possible to mitigate the significant impacts that a lapse in funding and subsequent shutdown would have on the department. In the event of a lapse in funding and a shutdown of the government, the Department of Defense will continue to carry out our fundamental responsibility and mission to defend our nation and the American people. Military personnel on active duty, including reserve component personnel on federal active duty, would continue to report for duty and carry out assigned missions worldwide to defend our nation and protect our national security interests. However, it's important to note that military personnel would not be paid until new funds are appropriated by Congress. Additionally, civilian personnel, including military technicians, who are not necessary to carry out or support accepted activities, would be furloughed with a lapse in appropriations. Objectively speaking, a lapse in funding will cause serious disruptions across the Defense Department and is still avoidable. Therefore, DoD urges Congress to reach a bipartisan, bicameral agreement on fiscal year 2025 appropriations and avoid a CR or worse, a government shutdown.
Pentagon Press Secretary Pat Ryder, Air Force Major General, at his news conference today at the Pentagon. Washington Today continues in a moment.
Listening to programs on C-SPAN through C-SPAN Radio is easy. Tell your smart speaker, play C-SPAN Radio, and listen to Washington Journal daily at 7 a.m. Eastern. Important public affairs events throughout the day. And weekdays, catch Washington Today. Listen to C-SPAN anytime. Just tell your smart speaker, play C-SPAN Radio. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. A few other headlines from Associated Press. A state appeals court on Thursday removed Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis from the Georgia election interference case against Donald Trump and others. The latest legal victory for the president-elect in criminal cases that once threatened his career and freedom. The case against Trump and more than a dozen others had already been stalled for months over an appeal related to a romantic relationship Willis had with Special Prosecutor Nathan Wade, whom she had hired to lead the case. And packaged foods in the U.S. will have to follow new rules in order to call themselves healthy, according to changes finalized Thursday by the Food and Drug Administration. It's an update of the agency's definition originally devised 30 years ago. President Biden on Thursday, begins a New York Times article, announced an aggressive new climate goal for the United States, saying that the country should seek to slash its greenhouse gas emissions by at least 61% below 2005 levels by 2035. President Biden put out a video.
I'm proud that my administration is carrying out the boldest climate agenda in American history. We're doing it by setting ambitious goals, like deploying 30 gigawatts of offshore wind and conserve at least 30% of our lands and waters by 2030, by setting standards to cut pollution from cars and trucks and power plants, and by signing into law the most significant investments in climate ever in the history of the world. That's why I'm proud to announce an ambitious new goal to cut greenhouse gas emissions by more than 60% by 2035. That's leading to more good-paying jobs, more affordable energy, cleaner air, cleaner water, healthier environment for everyone. It's also creating real momentum because we're unleashing American ingenuity and innovation. Americans will keep inventing and keep investing. State, local, and tribal governments will keep stepping up. And together, we're going to turn this existential threat into a once-in-a-generation opportunity to transform our nations for generations to come. I know we can do this. With the United States of America, there's nothing beyond our capacity if we work together.
President Joe Biden posting that video today. Story from Reuters. Incoming U.S. President Donald Trump's transition team is recommending sweeping changes to cut off support for electric vehicles and charging stations, and to strengthen measures blocking cars, components, and battery materials from China, according to a document seen by Reuters. The recommendations, which have not been previously reported, come as the U.S. electric vehicle transition stalls and China's heavily subsidized EV industry continues to surge, in part because of its superior battery supply chain. That from Reuters. Story from Bloomberg. The Biden administration is calling on Donald Trump's team to continue work on bolstering supply chains and moving key strategic industries back to the U.S., saying hard-fought progress since the pandemic could evaporate if fresh risks emerge. Lael, Brainard, who leads President Joe Biden's National Economic Council, is set to unveil a summary of supply chain recovery with a speech on Thursday at the Brookings Institution in Washington. In an interview with Bloomberg News ahead of the speech, Brainard emphasized that the Biden administration has made progress in smoothing out the disruptions and obstacles that fueled inflation. She said the system was now more resilient, but she also noted risks, particularly in sectors where China is looking to corner markets. That was from Bloomberg. Here's part of that speech from Lael Brainard at Brookings.
We've come a long way in the past few years. The number of container ships off our shores waiting to unload has fallen from 150 to about a dozen. The days of sales covered by retail inventories has risen by nearly a third since 2021 and is now roughly comparable to pre-pandemic levels. Shipping rates to the West Coast that had spiked to over $20,000 per container at the depths of the crisis are now back down around $4,400. But we are likely to encounter additional supply shocks in the years ahead. Just last year, we saw 28 climate disasters that each cost at least $1 billion. That's a record. Russia's war in Ukraine and conflict in the Middle East continue to disrupt the flow of energy commodities. Cyber actors are regularly targeting supply chain actors as a way to take down major companies, including hospitals. And we've seen a variety of disruptions to our shipping lanes, including the Houthi attacks on cargo ships in the Red Sea and reduced water levels in the Panama Canal. New dependencies are emerging, and some supply chain choke points could pose real national security risks, such as the ability of a foreign adversary to cut off supplies of a key mineral used in defense applications. It will be important to utilize the full scope of our national security tools when necessary. The Department of Commerce's ICTS rulemaking on data security for connected cars is vital, for instance, to ensure that foreign adversaries can't exploit consumer products that Americans use every day. We can't repeat the mistakes of the past when we didn't take vital action to safeguard the manufacturing of a critical input or technology like leading-edge semiconductors. America's global preeminence in strategic industries of tomorrow require active attention and engagement today. We need to work in partnership with the private sector when they identify critical bottlenecks.
Lael Brainard, White House National Economic Council Director, today at the Brookings Institution as the Biden administration released the first ever quadrennial supply chain review. On Wall Street, the Dow up 15, NASDAQ down 19, S&P down 5. Story from Politico Europe. Britain's Prime Minister warned Donald Trump against slapping tariffs on UK goods. In a committee grilling by MPs Thursday, Keir Starmer was pressed on his relationship with the U.S. president-elect, who has promised to impose steep duties on imports to his country. Starmer refused to get into whether he has raised the issue with Trump or shed light on how the UK might respond, but he said he was alive to the danger that such levies pose. Trump has promised to use executive authority on his first day in office to slap 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican imports, and he's promised new tariffs of up to 60% on Chinese imports. That was from Politico Europe. Here is the exchange in London between Prime Minister Keir Starmer and Liam Byrne, chair of the Business and Trade Committee in the House of Commons. Both of them are of the Labour Party.
Amongst the perils that we face next year is obviously now the looming threat of tariffs. So what are you going to do to dissuade President-elect Trump from imposing tariffs on the UK?
Well, I'm not going to speculate as to what he is going to do. It won't come as any surprise to you that I'm not a fan of tariffs, and therefore we have to make sure that we avoid tariffs. We've got very good trade with the US, as we've got very good trade with other countries around the world. I want to improve on that, and as you will know, I had a meeting with President Trump in September in New York. I've had a number of phone calls. Did you discuss this? Since, and including one yesterday. I won't go into the details of what we discussed, but am I alive to the danger of tariffs? Yes, of course. I'm against tariffs, but I'm not going to speculate as to what the incoming president might do.
You are committed to introducing or negotiating an SPS, a closer veterinary deal with the EU. That would probably rule out a grand bargain free trade deal with the United States, because we couldn't include something on agriculture in such a bargain. How are you going to put the two deals together, with Europe on the one hand and the United States on the other?
Well, I think that we can pursue both. I don't accept the argument that you've got to either be with the US or be with the EU. That isn't how it works at the moment with our current trade. We do want a closer relationship with the EU on security, on defence, on energy, and yes, on trade. And I've set out how we want to reset on a number of occasions. At the same time, I want to improve our trading relationships with the US. Is that going to be easy? Of course it's not. Do I think we can make progress? Yes, I do. That's among the reasons that I'm making sure we've got a good relationship with the incoming president, and that the relationship between our two countries remains as strong in the future as it has been in the past.
The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer questioned at today's first appearance as Prime Minister before the Liaison Committee that's comprised of other committees in the House of Commons in London. An Ipsos poll this week finds that 61% of Britons say they're dissatisfied with Keir Starmer, his worst performance as Labour leader. Back in the U.S., as the 118th Congress comes to a close, the Congressional Task Force on Combating Mexican Drug Cartels releasing their findings. It was set up in the summer of 2023 by former House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. The chair, Dan Crenshaw, Republican from Florida, with a news conference.
The United States executive and the U.S. Congress have to centralize our strategy against the cartels into one place. We do not prescribe where that place might be for the executive branch. We will leave that to President Trump. That could be in the White House. Maybe it's up to the AG. Maybe it's the DOD. But it needs to be centralized, and there needs to be a grand strategy that is articulated and somebody with some kind of operational control. For Congress, I think the answer is clear. I think we need to turn this task force into a select committee, and I've asked the Speaker to do just that. We don't have any staff, we don't have any resources, and we certainly don't have any legislative jurisdiction. When it comes to all of these different ideas and pieces of legislation that we like, we could be looking at 9 different committees of jurisdiction. That is no way to pass legislation. So we will be asking the Speaker for a select committee on this. And that would line up not only with what I just mentioned, but with President Trump's priorities.
Congressman Dan Crenshaw, Republican from Florida, chairs that task force on combating the Mexican drug cartels at a news conference today. We covered it in its entirety. You can find the video at cspan.org. A CBS News article about the ongoing violence reads an improvised landmine apparently planted by a drug cartel killed 2 Mexican soldiers and wounded 5 others. Mexico's defense secretary said Tuesday. Before the blast, the soldiers had discovered dismembered bodies of 3 people, officials said. The United States doubled the number of forces in Syria to fight the Islamic State group before the overthrow of President Bashar al-Assad's government. The Pentagon said Thursday. That begins an AP article. It goes on, the U.S. has previously said 900 troops were in Syria, but Major General Pat Ryder, the Pentagon press secretary, announced that 2,000 were there and had been for a while. He told reporters that the increase in forces was temporary, and they are there to augment U.S. operations against the Islamic State group. Pentagon has been asked repeatedly in recent days and weeks about the U.S. presence in Syria and never disclosed the dramatic increase. That was from the Associated Press. Here's the Pentagon press secretary.
In light of the situation in Syria and the significant interest, we recently learned that those numbers were higher. And so asked to look into it, I learned today that, in fact, there are approximately 2,000 U.S. troops in Syria. As I understand it, and as it was explained to me, these additional forces are considered temporary rotational forces that deploy to meet shifting mission requirements, whereas the core 900 deployers are on longer-term deployments. And as you know, for many of our deployments, numbers will fluctuate from time to time, but given that this number is significantly higher than what we've been briefing, I wanted to let you know as soon as I found out this information. I will say that there are diplomatic and operational security considerations oftentimes with our deployments, and some of those numbers, and certainly the case here. But again, given that there is significant interest in Syria, given what we have briefed previously, I wanted to make sure that you had the most up-to-date information. I will also highlight that, again, as it was explained to me, these forces, which augment the Defeat ISIS mission, were there before the fall of the Assad regime.
The Pentagon Press Secretary Pat Ryder, Air Force Major General, opening up his news conference today. Story from CNN. Russian President Vladimir Putin said he would inquire about the whereabouts of Austin Tice, the American journalist missing in Syria, while responding to a question from an NBC correspondent at his lengthy end-of-year press conference. Putin appeared to cast doubt, though, on whether Assad could account for Tice. He said, "But you and I are adults. We understand, right? 12 years ago, a man disappeared in Syria 12 years ago. We understand that the situation was there 12 years ago. There was active military action, and on both sides. Does President Assad himself know what happened to this American citizen, a journalist who was doing his journalistic duty in a combat zone? Nevertheless, I promise that I will ask this question to those people who control the situation on the ground in Syria today." The CNN article continues that the question for Putin on Tice came after the missing journalist's mother sent an emotive letter to Putin late on Wednesday in which she implores the Russian leader to help her find her son. This came up at today's State Department briefing in Washington with spokesperson Vedant Patel.
Does this department have any comment on Vladimir Putin saying he would ask about Tice's whereabouts after Deborah Tice requested his assistance?
So I'm just not gonna. I don't have anything to offer on that. If there is any country that wants to play a constructive role in locating Austin Tice, we certainly would welcome that. I will note, though, that for the many years that the Russian Federation has been the one to prop up the brutal Assad regime, that Mr. Putin had the opportunity to try and help ascertain the whereabouts or location or information about Mr. Tice, and hadn't done that in any of these previous instances. So I guess actions are going to speak louder than words, but Mr. Putin is welcome to do whatever he wants. What we are focused on is everything that we can do in our disposal.
State Department Deputy Spokesperson Vedant Patel at his news conference in Washington. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, begins a Reuters article, on Thursday announced some $200 million in additional humanitarian assistance for Sudan, where a conflict has killed tens of thousands of people and triggered the world's largest displacement crisis. Blinken, chairing a United Nations Security Council meeting on Sudan, said the funding would provide food, shelter, and health care to Sudan, where he said more aid needs to be delivered safely and rapidly. The article from Reuters. Here is Secretary Blinken at the UN in New York City.
6 years ago today, the people of Sudan rose up to topple a dictator and reclaim their own futures. Who can forget the iconic image of Ala Saleh, Lady Liberty of the Sudanese Revolution, standing on the roof of a car as she rallied her nation to a new path? One student protester put it this way: "We grinned with freedom on our face." Half a dozen years later, we see on too many Sudanese faces hunger, despair. The military takeover in 2021, the brutal fighting that erupted between the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces in April 2023 have derailed Sudan's transition to democracy and unleashed what is the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. Each day, as you've heard from our briefers, brings new atrocities. Attacks on hospitals, on markets, displaced persons camps, summary executions, women and girls subjected to unspeakable sexual violence, We continue to see war crimes and crimes against humanity committed across vast parts of Sudan. In Zamzam, people have resorted to eating grass and peanut shells. By some estimates, a child there dies every 2 hours for lack of food. And the effects of this tragedy extend well beyond Sudan's borders. Over 3 million Sudanese have fled to neighboring countries. Outside actors are arming and supporting both parties, turning an internal power struggle into a conflict with global dimensions. In short, failure to act in Sudan threatens the peace and security that this Council is charged with preserving. The world cannot, must not, look away from the humanitarian catastrophe that's happening in Sudan on our watch, before our eyes.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken at the United Nations Security Council in New York City. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter, word for word. It's free, and get the stories making headlines in Washington emailed to you every day. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.